Hey everyone, welcome to today's lesson where we're going to start learning how to program. So before we can build our game, we need to learn some of the fundamentals so that we can understand what's going on. So what exactly is programming? When you're programming, you're essentially writing a series of instructions for the computer to follow so that you can tell the computer what to do. So in programming, we need to use a programming language, and for us that's going to be Swift. And when we talk about learning programming, what we're actually mostly concerned with is learning the syntax of the language. And the syntax is basically how we structure our code so that the computer understands what we're trying to do. You can kind of think of syntax as the grammar for a language like English. And actually one of the best ways to learn the syntax of a programming language is to try it. And lucky for us, Xcode has something built in that allows us to do just that. So what we're going to do is open up Xcode. And on the right hand side, you'll see a list of your recent projects. So we can open up the project we created last time. And once the project's open, we can right click this folder and create a new file. And what we want to create is something called a playground. And as you can see, it tells you that playgrounds provide you an interactive environment to play around with your code. So you can think of it like a sandbox. So we're going to click next. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to leave it as my playground. And you'll see this file. So for us, we're just going to close this right hand panel because we're not going to really need it right now. So what's unique about this playground file is that you'll see that the file type for this file is .playground and not .swift like our code files. And the reason for this is that the playground file is not like the code file at all. So remember how last time when we clicked that play button, Xcode had to build all our code files in order to create the app? Well, the unique thing about this playground file is that Xcode continuously builds this file so that we can see the output right away. And for us, this is really useful because we can get immediate feedback right away without having to keep compiling our code. The other unique thing about this playground file is that while it is in our project, it's not part of our app, meaning that it won't get compiled with the rest of the files. So you can do whatever you want here and it won't affect your app at all. In fact, you can create a standalone playground without a project. But for us, we're going to create our playground in our project so we can come back to it whenever we forget some of the syntax that we've learned. So now that we understand what the playground is, let's take a closer look. I'm just going to resize this so that we can see what's going on. So in this playground, we can type in Swift code, and Xcode will run through it line by line from the top to the bottom, and it will display any output on the right. Because it gives us immediate feedback, it'll tell us even when we make a mistake. So we're going to use this playground to learn how to program with Swift. One of the first things we're going to learn about is variables. So what is a variable? Well, in programming, a variable is something that we use to store a value. As an example, when we make a game, we might need to store the number of lives a player has or their current score, and we would use variables to store these pieces of information. If we look at the new file that we created, we'll see that there are 3 lines that have already been typed for us. And this last line actually is an example of how we would create a variable. So in Swift, in order to create a variable, we use the var keyword, and then we type in the name we want to give to our variable. And finally, we can assign a value to it. So in this example, we created a variable named str, and it holds a piece of text that says hello playground. So one thing to keep in mind is that in programming, we're not only writing for machines, we're also trying to write for other programmers, and also for ourselves as well. So we want to use variable names that are descriptive. So here is an example of a variable that isn't descriptive. Because if you look at it, you don't really know what str really means or what it stands for. So we can go ahead and change it so that we'll know what the variable does. So for example, here we can change this to greeting. So these names have to be unique. So you can't have 2 variables with the same name. And the variable name also can't be a keyword. So you wouldn't be able to give a variable the name var because it's a word that's reserved in the language. And an easy way to identify these words is that Xcode will highlight these keywords in purple font when we type it in. Alright, so if we wanted to create a new variable to keep track of a hero's HP, for example, we can create a new line, type in var, and then give it a name. So for us, we might use hero HP, and then we can assign it a number. You notice that the values we assign to these variables are slightly different, and that's actually a very important component of variables in Swift, and it's that variables can hold different types of values. So for the first variable, we assigned it a piece of text between quotes. Now note that this value is actually hello playground without the quotes. So in programming, the term that we use to denote a piece of text is string. So we would say that the greeting variable has a type of string. In this second variable, hero HP, we assigned it a whole number or an integer. In programming, the term that we would use is int. So we would say that the hero HP variable has a type of int. So Swift will automatically determine the type of variable based on the value you assign it. But you can be more specific and explicitly tell Swift what the type of the variable is. So in order to do that, after the name of the variable, we can put a colon and type in the type. And we can do this with the number as well. Now you notice that a couple of things have happened since we created these variables. The first thing is that on the right hand side, the value of the variable shows up. Again, hello playground is surrounded by quotes, and that's just to denote that it's a string. The other thing you might have noticed is that whenever I was typing, a box kind of comes up. And that's actually a very important tool for us. And it's used for code completion. So what code completion does is that when you're typing, it tries to give you some hints as to what you might want to do, and it will fill it in for you. And so in order to kind of navigate through code completion, what you would do is, let's go back to the string, and I'll show you what happens. So when I type in S, this box comes up. I can press the up and down keys to kind of go through some of the different options, and I can press enter on the one that I want, and it'll fill it in for me. So this is useful if you ever forget what the keyword is, and you'll eventually learn to really appreciate this feature in Xcode. Since we're just starting out with learning the language, we might want to just fully type out the word rather than use code completion so we get a hang of what the keywords actually are. Alright, so going back to the types of variables, I mentioned that there are whole numbers. So there's also a specific type for decimal numbers, and in Swift that's a double. So we might create a variable to store the change we have in our pockets. And another useful type that we might use is something called a boolean, which represents a true or false value, kind of like an on-off switch. So we might create a variable describing whether or not our hero is healthy. So here, after we've created these four variables, we can change the values we gave to these variables, hence the name variable. And how we would do that is we can just type in the name of their variable without the var keyword, and we can give it a different value. So maybe we took some damage, so we can say that here HP equals 80. So we can even do things like math operations on them. So let's say I want to say that, the change in my pockets is 2 quarters. So I can do something like this, and it'll assign 0.5 to change in pockets. Not only that, we can even use one variable to assign a value to a different variable. So maybe I want to create a variable that holds the amount of money in the wallet. So we can see that the total money we have is the change in pockets plus the money we have in our wallet. We can even modify the variable using the variable itself. For example, if let's say our hero picked up a health pack, we might do something like this to say that the hero's HP increased. So you notice that we can do math operations with the int and double types. What about with string types? So with string, we can only add them together, and what happens is we combine the strings together. So for example, if I created first name and last name, I can add these together to create a full name. Obviously, I have to also add a space in the middle. So I can do something like this. So you'll see that we can just keep on going and typing and creating more variables, and eventually this file can get pretty messy. So one thing that we can do to help ourselves is to make notes within our code to remind ourselves of what's going on. And we can do this using comments. And actually, the first line in this playground shows you an example of a comment. And in order to type a comment, all you have to do is begin the line with 2 slashes. And what this tells Swift is basically to ignore whatever comes after these 2 slashes. So here we might say we're creating variables of different types. So we can also move code around if it doesn't break the logic of our code. So here we might move this line up so that we put them together, for example. And you can also take advantage of empty lines or spaces to format your code. So here you can see that we kind of use some empty lines to break up different parts of our code. Some people will also choose to align their equal signs when assigning a bunch of variables, just so it looks nice and it's easy to see at a glance what you're doing. But this isn't necessary. And so any spaces or empty lines within your code will kind of get ignored unless they're between quotation marks. So here this space is between quotes, so that's why it's treated as text. But outside of the quotations, you can put in as many spaces as you want, and it won't affect how the code works. In Swift, once we create a variable and assign it a value of a certain type, that variable cannot hold another type of value. So for example, the first name variable is holding a string type. So if we try to assign it an integer, we'll get an error. So whenever we get an error, we can click this red icon on the left hand side to get a more detailed explanation of what the error is. So we're going to remove this line. So that's something you have to keep in mind, that variables can only be of a single type. So you may be wondering, what about ints and doubles, since they're both representing numbers? So with numbers, it gets a little confusing because Swift is smart enough to figure out what type you need, so it'll make some assumptions for you. So if you try to assign a double variable using an int variable, you'll get an error. But if you were to type in a whole number, you don't get an error because Swift knows that total money is a double, so it'll treat that 2 as a double. And this type restriction even extends to math operations. So with a lot of programming languages, they actually allow you to add, for example, 2 to an integer variable to allow you to get to a decimal number. But in Swift, if you try to do that, it'll actually give you an error. And it'll tell you that the error is that int isn't convertible to double. So that's something that we'll have to remember. Swift is very strict in terms of their types, and you can't interchange ints and doubles, even though they both represent numbers. So that's why most of the time, even though we can let Swift determine the type for us, there might be cases where you have to be more specific. For example, if here I use the whole number 10, this would work because we told Swift that this is a decimal number, but if we were to take this type out, we'd actually get an error because by default, this 10 is an integer. So that's just something to keep in mind when dealing with numbers. So when it comes to variables, there's also a counterpart called constants. And from the name, you can tell what constants are meant to do. So you can think of constants as variables that don't change in value. And the difference between a variable and a constant is that in order to create a constant, you use the let keyword. And everything else about constants is the same as variables. So you might use constants to create variables that you don't want to change. So here, for example, the maximum number of lives a player has, you might not want to change that. And so here, if we try to reassign it, we'll get an error. And this is almost to help you as a developer to remember what values you want to change and what values you don't want to change. So that's about all we're going to learn for today. So before we go, we're just going to clean up and fix our error. And then we're going to commit our changes in source control so that we save a snapshot of the code that we have. So once this window pops up, you'll be able to see at a glance what changed. So for us, we created a new playground. So that's what we're going to type in here for our commit message. And then we can click commit. So now feel free to explore this playground and see what you can and cannot do with variables. Try creating variables of your own and see what happens. We learned a lot of different things in this video, so we're going to do a quick recap of what we learned. First, we learned about playgrounds and how it allows us to test code in a sandbox-like environment. We also learned how to format our code neatly using comments, empty lines, and spaces so that we can improve the readability of our code. And lastly, we learned that variables and constants allow us to store values of different types, and that you can change the value of a variable once you create it, but with constants, they can only ever hold one value. There are also a lot of different concepts about variables and constants, and I'll go over them quickly here. So in order to create a variable, we use the var keyword followed by the name. And to create constants, we do the same thing, but using the let keyword followed by the name of the constant. We learned that variables and constants can only hold values of a single type. And some of these types we learned are strings, which store text, int, which stores whole numbers, double, which stores decimal numbers, and bool, which stores a true and false value. And finally, we learned that Swift can automatically determine the type based on the value we assign the variable. And most of the time, we can safely let Swift do this. But if we wanted to be more specific, we can tell Swift the type of the variable or constant we want by using a colon after the name of the variable or constant. So that's about all there is for this video. Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe for more videos in the future.